my hope that this video inspires someone who is watching it to be generous and help out others around the holiday season. Thank you. Today I'm going to use 2 sheets of this type of siding, 1 sheet of 1/2 inch CDX plywood, and a whole bunch of other bits to make a toy donation box for the front of my house. This sheet will end up being the size of the box, so I'll start by cutting it in half. Then I'll cut off 3 inches from either side, and finally, a diagonal across the top for the roof to slope towards the back of the box. This makes the dimensions from the sides 3 foot 6 inches from front to back, 4 foot tall in the front, and 3 foot 6 inches tall in the back. I'm going to use this second sheet of siding to make the front and back of the donation box. I'll start by cutting it in half at the 4 foot mark, and trimming 6 inches off either side. When trimming the sides, I placed one piece on top of the other and cut them at the same time. This way there won't be any size differences between them, plus less measuring and less work. The dimensions for the front panel are 3 foot wide by 4 foot tall, and the back panel are 3 foot wide by 3 foot 6 inches tall. Right now I'm marking out where I want to cut the opening for the donation drawer in the top of the front panel. I went with making the opening 2 foot wide by 14 inches tall. Hopefully, this will be a good enough size to allow donations to go in, but not come back out. Now it's time to do the last few cuts for the back panel. I trimmed 6 inches off the bottom of the panel and ended up making the access door a 2 foot by 2 foot square that is 4 inches from the bottom of the panel. This will make the access door big enough to retrieve a tote box that is hopefully full of toys. Next, I'm going to use this 1/2 inch sheet of plywood to make the roof and floor of the donation box. After very carefully measuring the 4 sides that I've just cut, I cut the floor to perfectly fit once the sides were assembled, of course taking into account how the sides would connect to one another. With the floor cut out, it's time to build a frame out of 2x2s that will allow me to bolt the pieces together. I start by tracing up the skinny side of a 1x2 all the way around the perimeter of the plywood. The outside edge of the 2x2s will be screwed down along the inside of the lines that I just made. This will leave room for a 1x2 that will be on the side panel and will be the attachment point for how it all bolts together. If that does make sense, hopefully it will later on in the video. Each of the 4 2x2s get 3 equally spaced 1/2 inch holes drilled into them as bolt attachment points. The bolts that I'll be using for this are 3/8" bolts, so the 1/2 inch holes should allow for some wiggle room for things to line up properly. Since this is going to be outside in the weather for a few months every year, I'm going to glue everything together so no moisture can get trapped between the boards and cause a mildew problem. For this part of the project, I spaced the screws out about 4 inches apart from one another, and I used 1 3/4 inch long screws. Next up is the back panel. I started by attaching a 1x2 to the back side of the panel. The top of the 1x2 is set at 3.5 inches from the bottom. This will make it so that the floor will be flush with the bottom of the access door opening. I used a Forstner bit and a regular drill bit to drill holes into the 1x2 so I can embed T-nuts into it. This is how I will bolt everything together without having any attachment points visible from the outside of the box. Once the glue was fully cured, I went back and used 1 1/4 inch screws to secure the 1x2 to the panel. With the bottom 1x2 done, I'm going to move on to adding 2 2x2s on each side of the panel. Similar to the floor panel, I'm going to leave a space for the skinny side of a 1x2 between the 2x2 and the edge of the panel. Well, that was absolutely horrifying. I can't believe I wasn't paying attention and almost let that happen. When I cut the 2x2s for this panel, I also cut the corresponding 1x2s that go on either of the side panels. They're laying next to my gray level, and shortly I'll mark out where the bolt holes go on them. When I clamp the board to the panel, I place the clamps over where the bolt holes are in the board. This way, I have a physical barrier keeping me from putting a screw through where the bolts are supposed to go. I continue spacing the screws out at about 4 inches from one another, and whenever I'm attaching a 2x2, I use the 1 3/4 inch screws. The 1 1/4 inch screws are a bit too long, and they end up sticking out a bit on the opposite side. No trouble though, I'll just grind them down with my angle grinder. I also use the angle grinder to clean up the Gorilla Glue that foamed out on the sides. Like I did on the back panel, I'm attaching a 1x2 to this panel with the top of it being at 3.5 inches from the bottom. This edge is the front of the panel, and the 2x2 that I'm going to attach here needs to be pushed back to make room for the corresponding 1x2 that will be on the front panel. For those who don't know, these shiny metal things that I'm hammering into the wood are the T-nuts. This 1x2 can be attached flush with the edge of the panel because the boards on the back panel are already pushed back to make room for these boards. As I did before, I use my angle grinder to clean up any screws that are sticking through the 1x2 and clean off any glue that foamed out between the boards and the panel. Next up is the left side panel. Parts for this panel are the same as the last one. The first 1x2 will be placed 3.5 inches from the bottom. The other 1x2 will be patched flush with the back edge of the panel, and the 2x2 will be attached to the front with a bit of space between it and the edge. The way that I'm making these panels fit together is to have the two side panels fit in between the front and back panels. This means that when the box is viewed from the front, the edges of the side panels will not be visible. However, the edges of the front and back panels will be visible from either side. I actually made a mistake when attaching this 2x2. I forgot to have it set back a bit from the edge and screwed it down flush with the edge of the panel. Fortunately, I caught my mistake right away and reattached it in the correct spot. I have to be careful when making these panels that have the tips of screws sticking out on one side. If I'm not mindful of what I'm doing, I can cut my hand pretty badly. Don't ask me how I know that. Next up is the last of the sidewalls, which is the front panel. As with the other three panels, I first attach a 1x2 at 3.5 inches from the bottom. After that, I'm going to attach a 1x2 on either side. These boards need to be set back from the edge, but only far enough for there to be room for the thickness of the siding that I'm using. Every screw that I use on these panels is countersunk below the surface of the panel. I'm going to be using a putty to cover all of these screws so that the sides of the panels will look nice and clean. The T-nuts that I use have a flange that holds them in place in the wood. These larger, shallow holes allow the T-nuts to recess into the 1x2s, which in turn allows the 1x2s to lay flush on the siding. The T-nuts are preferable to simply screwing the box together with wood screws, because over time through repeated assemblies and disassemblies, the holes can strip out and become unusable. Since the T-nuts are made of metal, and as long as I'm careful, they should last for a very long time. For anyone who is confused as to why the lighting keeps constantly changing, I recorded this project over several days, and unfortunately in the end of November there just wasn't much daylight each day. Plus, because the sun was at such a low angle, some huge eucalyptus trees near my shop kept blocking the sun and casting a shadow on my work area. Alrighty, now that I have 5 of the 6 pieces mostly built, I can do a test fit to make sure that everything is going the way that I planned. It looks like everything fits together well enough. Now it's time to start working on the roof. After checking to see if it was square, which it was within 1/4 inch, I measured everything and cut the other half of the 1/2 inch sheet of plywood to fit on top of the box that I had built. I gave the roof a 3-inch overhang all the way around, except in the front, I gave it a 4-inch overhang. I wanted to add a little extra protection from the rain falling against the front of the donation drawer, but I didn't want it sticking out so far that an excited little one might not see it and smack their head on it. After quite a bit of mathing, I settled on what size to make the boards. I cut 2 of them to length, temporarily attached them, and did another test fit. After barely surviving that vicious attack with my life, I bravely got back to work. I've been trying out this new camera angle on my drill press. Let me know what you all think about it. Well, I eventually did that second test fit. I knew I did one at some point. With everything fitting as it should, I was set to start assembling the 1x2s permanently. I set each board in place with 3 screws from the underside. Then I flipped the roof panel over right side up and placed screws at about 6-inch spacing from one another all the way around. On the underside of this roof panel, there is a V-shaped split in the middle of the plywood. When I was assembling these 1x2s, I made it so the widest part of the V is towards the back of the roof. This gives me an easy visual indication as to which part is forward on a piece of this project which otherwise has no defining feature to indicate front or back. Now to go through and grind down all the screws that are sticking through on either side of this panel. One last test fit with all pieces securely screwed down. With the main part of the roof built, it's time to add the finishing touches. I decided to go simple with the fascia board and just cut them to fit. I could have been fancy and had the front and back ones beveled on one side so that they match the angle of the roof, but I figured it's just a donation box and I don't need to spend any more time on it. As with the other 1x2s, I kept the screws at about a 6-inch spacing from one another. With the roof fully completed, it's time to start finishing up the side panels. First up is the back panel. I cut some strips of 3/4-inch plywood at 2.5 inches wide, and combined with some 1x2s, I attached them around 3 sides of the access door opening. Since the access door itself will have a frame made of 1x2s, the 1x2s added here will make it so the door will sit flush with the rest of the panel when closed. And hopefully, the 3/4-inch strips of plywood will keep the rain from leaking in around the edge of the door. With everything clamped up, I placed screws all the way around the door at about 4 to 5 inch spacing from one another. Before I go forward, I'm going to grind down these screws so I don't hurt myself. To finish up this side of the box, I need to make a special 2x2 with a beveled edge for the top of the panel. This 8-degree bevel will make it so that the angle of the bolt holes will line up with the corresponding T-nuts that are built into the roof panel. That's 3 of 6 panels, all done and ready to go. Finishing up the side panels are a bit easier. They just need a 2x2 across the top with bolt holes that correspond with the ones in the roof panel. I added this extra 2x2 at about 16 inches from the front so that I could put a bit of plywood behind the donation drawer as an additional bit of protection to keep someone from reaching into the box and taking something out. Well, now I have 4 of 6 panels completed, and I'm on to finishing up the other side. These extra pieces of wood that will attach to the anti-theft panel are about 8 inches long. I wanted to make sure that the plywood went down far enough to block someone from reaching in, but not far enough to block donations from dropping down into the box at the bottom. With 5 of the 6 sidewalls completed, it's time to move on to the last major piece, which is the front panel that will have the donation drawer built into it. I cut some pieces of 3/4 inch plywood into a couple of strips that are 2.5 inches wide and one that is 3 inches wide. These strips will go around the donation drawer opening and create a bit of a guide as well as a seal around the drawer itself. These notches in the 3-inch strip are part of the guide for the drawer. Next, I glued the pieces to the top and sides of the drawer opening. Now that the glue has cured, I'm going to cut some channels into the back of the top strip of plywood. This will allow me to fit the bolts into the bolt holes once I attach the last 2x2 to the top of this panel. Lastly, I'll attach a 2x2 to the top of the panel. The 2x2 has bolt holes in it that correspond with the T-nuts that are embedded in the roof panel. I added this 2x2 across the middle of the panel to give some reinforcement as well as add to the panel's durability. With the possibility of the donation drawer opening and closing multiple times and getting a bunch of abuse, it doesn't hurt to make things a little extra strong. Next up is to add the frame to the access door. I simply cut some 1x2s to the size needed and attach them to the door with some 1 1/4 inch screws. A lot of these screws didn't countersink into the wood at this time, so I went back and did it off camera a little later on. Now it's time to cover all the screw heads with an epoxy putty. The putty that I'm using is a 2-part epoxy sculpting putty. I'm using this instead of regular wood putty because most wood putty is water-based. The problem that I have with that is that when it gets wet, it swells up and eventually will crack and fall off. This putty is not water-based, so water won't affect it, which means that it should stick to the panel and keep the front side of the panel looking nice and clean. Even though it is not water-based, I am using water to smooth it out, as well as the water is keeping it from sticking to my hands while I'm working with it. I've also found that when getting the 2 components out of their respective cans, keeping my hands damp will keep them from sticking to me and causing me to have another meltdown. Although this is the first video being uploaded to my channel where I use this epoxy putty, it's not actually the first time that I've used it on a project. I actually used it when making a couple of Halloween projects earlier this year that I didn't quite finish in time for the holiday. This putty comes in 2 parts, a part A and a part B. When mixed together, they start to harden in about 45 minutes. Part A is very soft and reminds me of marshmallows, whereas part B is very tough and moves like cold molasses. So another trick that I have found to be useful when getting the 2 individual parts out of the can is to use my heat gun on part B to soften it up. It makes scraping it out of the can so much easier, as well as mixing them together is much easier too. The first project where I used this type of epoxy putty didn't go so smoothly. I didn't know any of the tricks that I mentioned earlier, and it caused a bit of frustration as well as quite a bit of a meltdown because things just were not going well. The last trick that I'll give is that gloves just can't be used with this stuff. It's got to be bare hands because this stuff just sticks to the gloves way too much. With all of the pieces smoothed out with the putty, it's time to move on to paint. But first, I'll need to clean up the roof panel with a bit of sanding. For the roof panel, I'll be using this deep tint primer. For the top half of the roof, I'm going to use 2 coats of primer and 2 coats of paint. The underside will only get 1 coat of each. The reason is that I'm expecting the roof to get more water on it than the underside, so I want it to be extra waterproofed. The cold weather and short hours of daylight slowed down the painting process quite a bit. And with this last coat of black paint, the roof is fully finished and ready for the reveal at the end of the video. When I painted the floor panel, I went a similar route as the roof, but in reverse. I painted the underside of the floor with 2 coats of primer and 2 coats of black paint, and the top of the floor got 1 of each. My reasoning is that the box will be outside and on the dirt. Any moisture that gets underneath it will keep everything damp, so I wanted to provide extra protection to hopefully prevent any issues with mildew. In the middle of when I was painting, it did start raining one day, which delayed me being able to finish this project for a couple of days. And with that, the floor is finished. Next, I'll work on the right side panel. I started off trying to use my paint sprayer, but it just wasn't working right, so I grabbed a brush and got on with it. I used the brush for the bumpy surface of the siding and suffered through my poorly working sprayer to smooth out the paint on all of the boards. I eventually got my sprayer working well enough that I could do a coat of primer on the front. Lastly, to finish up this panel, I coated it with 1 heavy coat of jade green. With that, the first sidewall is fully finished. For this left side panel, I'll do all the same steps as before. Well, almost all of the same steps. I forgot what I was doing for a moment and started spraying the green instead of the primer. Well, I guess the only thing to do is lay down 2 coats of paint and hope for the best. Now I have 4 of 6 pieces fully finished. Up next is the rear wall panel. I know that the fronts of the siding don't exactly need primer, but I just want to make sure that the colors blend between the epoxy putty and the panel. The one downside to using a brush to paint the primer on the back of this siding is that it took such a long time to fully dry. Finally, both the access door and rear panel are fully dry and ready to assemble. I ended up cutting out notches into the access door off camera. Unfortunately, by this time in the project I had been working on it for 2 weeks and had recorded upwards of 22 hours of footage, and I just didn't want to add more footage that I would have to edit through later. The hinges that I'm using are inexpensive, non-removable pin hinges, and I thought that the black locking latch would look really slick against the green paint. In the end, this box will be very secure. Just so long as someone doesn't use a circular saw on it, we're good. I'm down to the home stretch. One last panel to go. Painting is so much easier when my sprayers are working right. With the front panel fully painted, it's time to add the trim board around the opening for the donation drawer. With all of the pieces cut, I'll coat them with 2 coats of spray primer. Next, I'll finish them up with 2 coats of spray gloss white. I can now assemble the trim boards onto the front panel. I had to be careful when measuring the trim boards to make sure that there was a little bit of space along the bottom so that the trim boards wouldn't interfere with the donation drawer's ability to open all the way. I used this finishing nail gun to nail them to the panel, and unfortunately the project took longer than expected and I was running out of time to get the box set up and collecting donations. I didn't have time to patch over the finishing nails, but after this season, I'll get it looking right. And now, for the grand finale, the main event, the building of the actual donation drawer itself. I started by measuring 14 inches and then marking my angle at 120 degrees from that. I then used a jig to draw a curved line between the 2 lines and then proceeded to cut out 2 of the same parts. With the 2 side pieces roughed out, it was time to move over to my table saw to cut out the front and back panels. I cut one sheet to match the opening at 14 inches tall by 24 inches wide, which ended up being the back panel. The piece for the front of the drawer ended up being around 20.5 inches wide and about 12 inches tall. Both pieces ended up having a bevel on the edge closest to the hinges. To finalize the shape of the 2 side pieces, I had to trim off about an inch to the front 90 degrees of the curve. This will allow it to fit into the guide that I built into the front panel. A quick cleanup and they'll be ready for paint. For the hinges to work properly and for the drawer to rotate correctly, I had to cut some notches for the hinges into the bottom of the back panel. The hinges need to sit right on the peak of the angle that is created by the 2 side pieces for the drawer to rotate properly. If they're forward or behind the peak, the drawer will get taller or shorter as it opens and closes. I also trimmed the bottom of the siding that goes on the front of the drawer with a bevel so the drawer can open all the way. Lastly, I need to clean everything up with a bit of sanding and then paint. Before I assemble the drawer, I'm going to paint all the plywood pieces with 2 coats of spray-on clear coat. It was raining this day, so I had to paint these pieces inside my shop. I did have a window open and a fan blowing fresh air on me at full speed. It's time to do the final assembly of the drawer. I started with attaching the 2 side pieces to the back panel. When attaching these 2 curved pieces, I had to be careful that I had everything facing the right direction. With the 2 sides fully attached, it's time to get the front panel into place. I used these extra long screws when building this part of the project because over the course of multiple test fittings, the holes didn't grip the smaller screws anymore. I quickly wipe off any glue squeeze out with a rag and start working on adding the siding to the front of the drawer. Through various test fittings, I figured out where the siding should be attached to the front of the drawer so that when it's closed, everything will sit flush on the front panel. I don't usually do this, but this time I misted the Gorilla Glue with water to activate it. For this panel, I was very thorough in making sure that it was securely pressed up against the plywood. The next day, when the glue had fully dried, I went about doing the last bit of finishing touches before it would be ready for paint. This includes covering any screw heads or extra holes with epoxy putty. Finally, it's painting time. With the primer dry, I move on to doing 2 coats of this bright Christmassy red color. I chose to paint the front of the drawer red instead of the same color as the rest of the box, so that it would stand out and pop against the green. The last detail that I'm going to add to this box is some bright white letters on the front of the donation drawer. Now, without cheating, can y'all guess what it's going to say? I picked up these letters at Michael's, and they're not exactly what I would call all-weather types of objects. So with that in mind, I'm going to absolutely cake them in spray paint. Well, there it is. Mystery solved. Now it's time to completely finish this box. I'm going to start with the letters on the bottom and work my way upwards. I laid all the letters out so that they're evenly spaced and will fit within the boundaries of the front of the drawer. I used a couple extra scrap pieces of trim board to use as spacers so the letters would be high enough up on the drawer so that when it was fully open, the letters wouldn't connect with the trim on the wall panel. I used my finishing nail gun and the shortest nails that I had to attach the letters to the front of the drawer. I had to be very careful when nailing these letters down because they are very skinny and I didn't want my nails to split or break them. I have 2 last tasks to complete. The first is to make a stencil and spray paint the inside of the drawer, and the last is to install a handle on the outside of the drawer front. Oh yeah, I forgot, I added these little extra bits so that the drawer can't open past 90 degrees. And there it is. I think that adding the brass handle really gave it that little bit of extra Christmas magic. I've been wanting to add this to my display at my house for a couple years now, basically ever since we started doing the Christmas Village booth back in 2020. I reached out to a local charity in my area and they sent me the PDF for their flyer to put up on the front of the box. Considering that it was built pretty late in the season and I only got about 10 days before the cutoff date, I was actually able to get a few very generous donations. With the donations that my household added, we came out of it with a nice little pile of donations and it was worth building it this year, and next year will be even better. With that, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Winter Solstice, Happy whatever you do or don't celebrate, and I'll see you next time.